everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the healing power of empathy. I'm Chris Sundberg, a founding member and executive director of Elder Voice Family Advocates. Our mission is to assure that quality care is provided to every resident of long-term care from a team of caring, empathetic direct care staff. For this reason, we are delighted to host this very important webinar. Synonyms for empathy are appreciation, compassion, insight, rapport, and warmth. All of these embody the power of empathy. Every human being, regardless of age or ability, wants to be appreciated for who they are, treated with compassion from people who seek insight into each as an individual. Use this insight to establish rapport and demonstrate warmth in every interaction. These are the gold standard for empathetic care. Our speakers will spend an hour and a half going into more detail about that incredible healing power of empathy. Before I introduce our speakers, let me take care of a couple of housekeeping items. Just to make you all aware, there will be a lag time of a few seconds between speakers as the slide program transitions over to them. Also, we're going to open this up to questions during the presentation, but pose your questions in the chat box that you see below. And we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. But if we don't have time to complete and get through all those questions, we will answer them via email to you after the fact. Now, to introduce our speakers, it's my privilege to introduce Elon Caspi. He is a PhD in gerontology and is a dementia behavior specialist. Elon currently works as an assistant research professor at the University of Connecticut. He started working in the aging field 28 years ago as a nurse aide in a nursing home where his grandfather lived. Since then, he worked as a social worker in a nursing home, consultant, applied researcher, author, documentary film director, and care advocate. In recent years, he conducted several studies to improve understanding and the prevention of various forms of elder mistreatment in long-term care homes. Elon led the elder voice research of Minnesota maltreatment in long-term care homes. This research contributed greatly to the passage of the elder care reform legislation of 2019. He serves on the board of Elder Voice Family Advocates and the Long-Term Care Community Coalition in New York City. Nancy Haugen is a registered nurse and RN public health nurse in Minnesota. She earned her baccalaureate nursing degree from the College of St. Catherine and a master's degree in mental health nursing from the University of Minnesota. For more than 25 years, Nancy has provided nursing leadership to multiple teams composed of public health nurses, registered and licensed practical nurses, and unlicensed assistive personnel. She was a public health nursing preceptor for more than 30 years and has taught nursing assessment competency for the Minnesota Department of Education. Nancy currently serves as a board member also of Elder Voice Family Advocates and the Minnesota Department of Health Assisted Living and Home Care Advisory Council. Bob Savage grew up in a small town in northern Maine. Bob joined the Air Force, and after 4 years of service, he returned to school to get a Bachelor in Science degree in management. He graduated magna cum laude and was selected as a class speaker at graduation. He then worked for 11 years for the Singer Manufacturing Corporation, working in the marketing division located in New York City. From there, he became a teacher at a drug treatment facility run by and for addicted persons to assist them in their recovery from addiction. That started a career in addiction-related programs for the next 60 years. Soon after Bob's retirement, his wife started to notice that his memory was starting to diminish. Bob finally agreed to be tested, and the results were early stage Alzheimer's and signs of vascular deterioration. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, Bob had a stroke. Soon he recognized that he could no longer responsibly drive and turned over his license to his wife. In Bob's own words, he said, "Now I was convinced that I had completely lost my sense of independence and would have to depend on others for anything I would like to do. At the same time, I was losing control of my temper. My wife and I decided that perhaps we should seek care in an assisted living home." And that's where Bob has been for the past 5 years. But he soon used that valuable time to become an active educator and advocate for the rights and quality of care of people living with dementia. He facilitates support groups for his population and is founder of Dementia Peer Coalition. With that, Elon, I will turn it over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for the wonderful introduction of my colleagues, Nancy and Bob and myself. We will start this segment with a few questions that we prepared for Bob. So he will basically kick it off, and then we're going to move to my part of the presentation. And then I would hand it off to Nancy. And at the end, we're going to leave some time for some Q&A at the end of the webinar today. Bob, there are common misconceptions in our society related to people living with dementia. What is your reaction when you hear people say the following things about people living in advanced stages of dementia? One of the things we hear is, he's no longer there, or don't bother interacting with her because she's out of it. What would you say to that?
This is caused by the stigma that our society places on individuals immediately after we are diagnosed with any form of dementia. The stigma goes back to the early 1900s when it was identified as a form of mental illness. Today, however, dementia is recognized as a person living with dementia as having a disease of the brain. In Connecticut, the state agency responsible for dementia services was moved from the Department of Mental Health to the Department on Aging in recognition that it is not a mental health issue, but it's caused by a disease of the brain. It will take some time for our society to recognize that dementia is caused by the disease. Shortly after I was diagnosed as having vascular deterioration in the early stages of Alzheimer's, I attended a workshop that was led by a person living well with dementia. The first 2 hours of our workshop was devoted to our sharing what we were doing to help us adjust to our ongoing changes in our brain, as well as our physical changes. During the second hour, she stressed that it's important for us to continue to do what we had previously described. She then encouraged us to develop a strong sense of purpose. From that point on, my priority became, in all that I do individually, speaking in public like this, is to help reduce the stigma that exists in the United States.
To carry that stigma of Alzheimer's, you had used the word dementialized. Could you please share what that means to you and how nurses themselves either contribute to that stigma or alleviate it?
After I was diagnosed, I was stigmatized. I sort of coined that phrase. I don't think you're going to find it in the dictionary. But what it means It means that as soon as you're diagnosed, you become stigmatized. That's a scary word. That's a scary word. And what happened then is my family started treating me differently. My friends started treating me differently. They would speak slower to me. They would avoid me. This was immediate. And there was other negative reactions as well. And I went into a deep depression for about 6 months. I even thought seriously of suicide. I ordered a book from Mexico. I got the drug, but I found that if my wife gave me the pill, that she would be in prison for life. So I decided I wouldn't do that. And thank God I didn't, because shortly thereafter, I started to come out of it a little bit. And as I said, I developed a sense of purpose. And today, I'm so privileged to be doing so many things like this.
Thank you very much. You've been living for 5 years in your community. Could you describe what nurse empathy means to you, how you have experienced that, and any positive effects it has on the well-being of people living with dementia?
I think that the role for nurses is very important and plays a very important role in providing our care. We are fortunate where I live in assisted living to have 2 nurses who provide us with our medication and care daily. They allow us time to discuss any issue that we may have with our medications and how are we doing in our other areas of living. They have an excellent relationship with the head nurse of the agency, who is also very supportive. And as a result, any issue that we may have can be resolved quickly. It's important that they now have been with us for a year. We know them very well and vice versa. We get to share our experiences and they share their experiences with their families and also what takes place in the communities. We see each other as individuals living our lives in our own respective ways. They're very strict in carrying out their medications and sharing the information with each other. They also act as a valuable role for the CNAs working with us. This provides us with the opportunity for staff and us to have valuable conversations, as well as how we can develop our individual interests. Steps are taken to improve communication for all our residents, regardless of the level of their dementia.
Ask you about your thoughts about close trusting relationships. What do you see as the role of nurses in building and nurturing close trusting relationships with residents living with dementia in order to support them with empathy and provide dignified care?
Nurses play a critical role in the medical field to help the doctors share the medical messages in an empathetic way. We have found here that all our nurses have that natural sense of empathy. Somehow or other, they do it with all of us. And I'm sure they're tired at the end of the night, but it's just natural. Their sense of humor is, it's open. It's not fake, it's real. And so nurses are a critical part in the care of all of 133 of us here.
Thank you, Bob. And as part of building and nurturing these close, trusting relationships with residents living with dementia, what do you see the role of director staff and nurses learning about the early life history of the person as a way to inform their interactions with residents and the care they provide?
Well, learning our life history gives them the tools on how to more directly relate with us. We're all unique individuals, and if they're willing to take the time to get to know us, then we become friends, but also they have the knowledge of how to help and how to make recommendations. Could I give an example?
Absolutely.
Please.
Okay. As I said, I live in assisted living for 5 years now. And Live Well, the organization I live with, has a beautiful garden on their grounds close to the building where it is fenced in. I love to work there on various projects in the summer. A woman with advanced dementia would frequently be brought there in a wheelchair by a personal caregiver and left by herself and checked on periodically. She enjoyed sitting there by herself on the beautiful days. Having had some experience in interviewing residents living with several different levels of dementia, I decided to see if I could communicate with her. First, she would look at me with no verbal response. I then held her hand, introduced myself, and eventually she looked at me and started talking. I learned her name. It was Hazel. And we started a conversation, learned about her family. It's not really Hazel. Where she lived, and she was a counselor in the state prison. One day, after holding her hand, she looked at me seriously and said, "Some days, Bob, things are very difficult to deal with." And she started counseling me. I got to know her very well. One day, a young man was sitting on a bench close to Hazel, looking sad and frustrated. I went over and asked him what was wrong. His response was, "I drive here all the way from New York and she does not recognize me, so why bother?" I asked her to watch me. I held her hand, she recognized me, and we started a conversation. And I asked him to try to do the same thing. He sat next to her, held his hand, and very emotionally said, I'm your nephew from," and she knew him immediately. He came back on a regular basis.
That's beautiful.
Oh, and Bob, that ties into my very next question. When I visit secure care homes, people seem to be so lonely. They're sitting with their heads down and their eyes closed, and no one approaches them for long periods of time. Have you yourself been affected by this type of loneliness? And how have nurses responded to either help or not be so helpful?
Well, loneliness starts immediately after you're diagnosed because you're treated as a different person. And I've accepted the fact that I will be lonely from now until the day I die. And so once you accept that, it helps a little. What I've done, I started to think in my early period of, look, I have a wife, children, grandchildren. We're now living in a community where you have no choices or little choices. There are residents you get along with, and those are very difficult to live with. We have no choice to change where we live or to find a place that is more suitable. There are some positives, however. We have the time to pursue our interests like never before, and we have the support from staff to help us pursue that once they get to know them. I now have time to pursue my purpose, which is, as I said before, and I love repeating it, spend as much time as possible to reduce stigma that society places on us. Let me show you quickly my painting on loneliness. You can see that it's not very colorful and it's pretty black. And how I paint, I take one section and just paint my emotion with no thinking of any design. I turn it around and I do it 4 times. And this is what showed up. In there, right, in there I showed up. And I'm leaning over and all that loneliness is on my shoulder. Very powerful.
Thank you very much, Bob. do the nurses in your communities help people with loneliness, or is that something that is just sort of left up to individuals to figure a way to connect?
Well, COVID has really dried that up. We're going into another period of shutdown with the new COVID. Prior to COVID, people would come and visit. They still can come, but they have to wear a mask all the time. And I'm worried at one point nobody could come because it was so risky. Because one person gets it, 133 people are at risk. And so it's very hard, difficult thing to deal with loneliness. Our only connection is with other people that are here. And sometimes, and there's only, we're not all that compatible. And we're all at different levels of dementia, I'll say it politely. And so it's just something I have to deal with.
Bob, would you say that your advocacy over Zoom with peers and colleagues and educating people has some measure to in terms of alleviating some of the loneliness, in terms of giving you purpose? How would you describe that?
Well, what I'm doing now is I'm leading a support group of residents that are living here. And we now have 5 people that are willing to work with me and work with us. We've identified a number of issues. And some of them are usual. Don't treat us like children. Answer the damn phone. And who do I talk to if I have a problem? And will it be resolved? What happens when I ask? So all those questions are related to the residence council. Where we are right now in the process is that the management is starting to recognize our voice. And we are now able to follow, once we make the complaint, where it goes, how it's resolved, and then how it comes back to us so we can actually experience it. This affects not only the 5 of us, but all the people who are in different levels of dementia. Because go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. So you kind of partially answered our last question about resident councils. I mean, you mentioned support groups, but also resident councils. So do you have anything else to add about resident councils, or
I think what I'd like to stress is what I touched on earlier. Organizations can have the most beautiful plan in the world on how to deal with issues, and they tend to get lost in the plan and how well they're doing with it, rather than changing the results. And this is where the voice of the persons living there becomes very important. But residence councils are very important.
A little bit of background about the video that we're about to see now. In this video, Naomi Feil, many of you know, is the founder of Validation Method. She has over 50 years experience working with and supporting people living with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. In this video, what we will see is Naomi interacting with an 87-year-old woman by the name of Gladys Wilson. I think that the video speaks for itself. And so we're gonna reflect upon it after we'll complete watching it. So we know they say a video is worth 10,000 words. So I hope you'll find it meaningful.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech, but they have human needs that need to be expressed. You're crying. You're crying. You have a tear right here in your face. You have a little pain. You don't want me to touch you. You're very sad. Can you see me? Is it scary? Are you afraid? And if this person sits with their eyes closed, rocking back and forth, and maybe there's a tear coming down, there's a need there. There's a little tear that's coming out. Do you feel it? You feel a little tear? If you gently use touch, and I touched Gladys Wilson for the fingertips right here on the cheek, is where the mother usually touches a child. If you touch an infant there, it looks up, and every cell remembers where it was touched by the mother. And often that person knows, even if they can't say a word at that moment, they won't talk, or they don't want to talk, but there's a communication. And that person is no longer alone. Can you let me in a little bit? You think? Just a little? You think I could be with you and Jesus for a minute? Jesus loves me, yes, I know, for the Bible tells me so. I used music, because when speech is gone, music, especially with Gladys Wilson, it was religious music, because there's emotion tied to it and safety tied to it. So I used her old church songs. Jesus loves me, yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me, the Bible tells me so. What I did was, when she moved, I moved with her. And when I was singing, because she didn't sing with me, so I matched the intensity of my voice to the intensity of her movement. And pretty soon, for a split second, we became one person. Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. The Bible tells me so. So at one point, when she got very quiet and very peaceful, and my voice became very quiet as hers and very peaceful, and my breathing slowed to her breathing, she pulled me to her, and I moved with her. And for her, at that moment, I believe I was a symbol of her mom. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you sing with me? He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying, and you keep centering yourself, and really look at that person, and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe? You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
think that, it's hard to unpack 50 years of experience working with people living with dementia, but some of the things that enabled Naomi to connect on a deep human level with Gladys, one of the first things is the ability to be centered. I should take a step back, and the ability to create the conditions, the physical environment conditions for this interaction, the quiet environment, no distractions, the privacy here. And then the centering. So there's actually a centering breathing technique that enables the person who's validating the person with dementia to clear themselves from their own emotion, their frustrations. We all bring our own stuff from home when we go and provide care for elders. So the only way to genuinely and effectively validate the person with dementia in advanced stages is when you're able to center yourself, when you're fully present and attentive to the individual. Another technique is calibrating the emotional temperature of the individual with whom Naomi interacted. You observe the person carefully and you try to sense where they are in that moment, so you can actually connect with them wherever they are in that moment. So again, to be fully present, to be able to be attentive and build the trust to connect with her. She used multiple validation techniques. There's about 15 of them. I'll share resources in a minute. She mirrored her emotional states and her movement. She used a very soft, gentle, respectful tone of voice. She leaned down to the level of her eyes. That sends a message of equals. She used personally meaningful music. So she knew her life history and she used those gems to connect with her on a deep level. We know music is hardwired in the brain and remains into very late stages of the disease. In fact, with some individuals until the last breath. So these are some of the things we've seen there. And I think the big message here is that the person with dementia is always there, always. They are not living dead. They don't die twice. They're not fading away. They are not shells of their own selves. Their soul and self remains preserved until their last breath. These are very powerful myths and stigmas that that the media in particular is filled with, and that instills fear, and that fear serves as a barrier to connect with these individuals, as Naomi just demonstrated. Of course, the touch, you see the touch there, the gentle touch. And that being said, we should emphasize that some people in general, let alone people with dementia, don't want to be touched. So we need to know who likes, who can tolerate it, who wants it. And it has to be gentle, compassionate touch. We need to remember that too. We talked a little bit about centering a minute ago. Naomi teaches in her book, I'm trying to move to the next slide. In her book, she and DVD that is here on the slide, she teaches how to center yourself and how to use the other 14 techniques that she developed over many years. And one of the first place I would recommend people to go, those who want to learn about the validation method, is the Validation Training Institute. That's where you're going to find all the resources about this powerful, empathetic approach. In the picture, you see a granddaughter of a woman with Alzheimer's disease. When Erin was a junior in high school, she wrote in a paper, "Until we find a cure, our family will fight for nanny, because underneath the shell of memory loss, the confusion and the sadness, there is a person with a heart that will always, always remember." And here's a definition of empathy: the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another human being. Other those in the past, those experiences and feelings in the past or the present. That is, without these being fully communicated in an objective way. Now, we are in the middle of a crisis, nearly 2 years, horrific pandemic, incredible trauma, soul-crushing isolation and loneliness. How can we come today and speak with you about empathy? We thought about it a little bit. And when there's such a shortage of staffing, how is it even realistic, right? So when we thought about it, we reached the conclusion that this is exactly the time that we need to talk about empathy. There is such a shortage of staffing. There is such a inadequate training. There's waivers related to training. You have float staff. You have external agency staff. You have staff turnover. You have the National Guard deployed again this week by the governor of Minnesota to nursing homes. And after this horrendous pandemic, this is exactly the time when we need to set the standard as high as possible, what we all need to aspire when we interact, support, and care for individuals in care homes, empathic care. And as Tom Kitwood, who wrote the groundbreaking book, Dementia Reconsidered, The Person Comes First, he said that people with dementia can teach us, it's something important to teach the rest of humankind. But if it's only when we make the intentional effort to connect with them on a deep human level, we might learn something about ourselves. And some of the things that we can learn about ourselves is to be present, to be fully present, to listen actively, to be attentive, to appreciate the simple things that we take for granted. And people with dementia can teach us how to appreciate them more deeply. And there's many other things, of course, that people with dementia can teach us. About a decade ago, I gave a talk in a support group for people with dementia, a support group of family members providing care to people with dementia in the community. And one of the daughters said that she's caring for her mom with Alzheimer's disease. And she said that she's the only one in her family that is able to effectively communicate and gain the cooperation of her mom. The interesting part of the story was that the daughter was deaf and the mother could hear, but she never learned sign language. And I think the message of this story is that people with dementia will respond to the unspoken, even if you said the right thing. People with dementia are experts in sensing our core emotions. They're absolutely experts. And they also preserve the ability to feel emotions throughout the disease journey. So this was from Jane Gerard from the Minnesota Department of Human Services. That's that quote at the end. So they will listen mostly to the unspoken. And what do we mean by the unspoken? It's the body language, the facial expressions, the gestures, the tone of voice, the expression in the eyes, how you hold yourself physically when you are interacting with the individual. That's what they're going to pay attention to. So I guess the message here is we need to use less words when we interact with people with dementia. And just going back to, so, by far, the number one asset we can build and nurture with people living with dementia is close, trusting relationships. This allows us to establish what is called authentic partnership with them. This is the most enlightened care organizations in the world. They put it actually as the number one item on their mission statement. And when you have that, when you are successful in allocating the resources that empower the staff and support the staff in building and nurturing those relationships, you are in a much better position to not only identify subtle changes from their baseline condition, but also their emotional state, change in their emotional states, the behavioral states. And you can more proactively, in an anticipatory care approach way, fulfill their varied human needs. And as you can see here in the picture, I think pictures are speaking for themselves here, the connection, the human connection. What you see when you see a interaction that is successful with a person with dementia is you see partnership. You see authentic partnership. You see a collaboration. What you see is friendship. That's what you see when we're looking at a close trusting relationship interaction with this population. And that's also preventative, because when we have those relationships, we can prevent a whole host of care-related issues attentively and proactively. And as Zgola, in her very, very excellent book, Care That Works, a relational approach with people with dementia, the person with dementia's trust is the single most important asset a staff person or a nurse can have. It's hard work to build it, and it could be easily compromised. All you need is to approach a person with dementia who's seated on a chair and pull their chair from behind themselves without asking for permission first. Or roll your eyes when a person with dementia is unable to say something that doesn't sound meaningful. Or speak about them in their presence in a third person manner, as if they are a dead object that should be disregarded. And this is how we can damage the trust with them very easily and very fast. And so what we're talking about is relationship-based care, emotion-based care, as we mentioned earlier. And you see the respect as this woman who is leaning down and sending an underlying message. Who is in charge of this conversation, really? It's the woman, the older woman in the picture. So as a very insightful and experienced director of recreation therapy said many years ago in one of my earlier studies, when she provided staff training on prevention of behavioral expressions in this population, she said, be responsive to what their needs might be. It's all about our approach. It isn't us, it isn't them, it's about their needs. So what are the needs of people with dementia beyond the physical, medical, functional needs? Professor Tom Kitwood, the late Professor Tom Kitwood from the UK, conducted years of observations, and he identified 6 main psychological, emotional needs of people with dementia. The need for comfort, but not just physical, psychological comfort, to feel emotionally secure, to feel the ability to preserve one's identity and personhood, to be occupied, to do something meaningful, personally meaningful with your time, to feel a sense of purpose and to feel useful to others. A sense of inclusion, to be with people that you trust and enjoy the company of, and attachment, close trusting relationships. And then the central need we all share, to love and to be loved by others. And frankly, when you look at those needs, we all share those needs. People with dementia are not different. They are sharing those universal human needs. The problem is that we, for decades, focused so much on activities of daily living and cognition. And in the process, we left the emotional, psychological needs overlooked oftentimes. And that's a recipe for a lot of care-related problems and restlessness and anxiety and preventable behavioral expressions. So here are examples of 12 types of positive interactions that Tom Kitwood identified. I'm not going to go through all of them. You know, to affirm the person in the moment in interaction, recognizing them as a human being, collaborating with them, using stimulation, which is, you know, sense-based interactions. Could be aromatherapy, as done so beautifully at English Rose Suites in Minnesota. Celebrating the moment with them, relaxing with them, validating their emotions, holding them. It's not just physically, but psychological holding as a vessel, a container of emotion, facilitating the interaction with them and the communication. And then the last two are creation and giving, are actually initiated by people with dementia when they are oftentimes giving us gifts, but because we're so busy, we may miss those gifts. They may start dancing, as I've seen. There was music in the background. They started dancing in the main room, in the main TV lounge. They started dancing. More residents joined them, and they had such a wonderful time and momentum, only for inexperienced recreation therapists to come in and say, sorry guys, I got to turn off the music. It's trivia time. So they give us a gift. Why not be flexible and go along with it and wait with trivia for a little later. So they're giving us a lot of opportunities to engage with them and enable them to experience the highest practical emotional well-being. And then there's many aspects of what Tomke would call malignant social psychology. These are demeaning and dehumanizing actions that staff may engage with these individuals, whether it's deception, infantilizing them, intimidating them, labeling and stigmatizing them, not validating their inner subjective emotional experience, excluding them, ignoring them, treating them as objects, accusing them, mocking them, and these are some of the examples. And in his book, he provides detailed examples of these. And this is an example of what Joan Koenig Costa, in her wonderful book, Learning to Speak Alzheimer's, she says, Alzheimer's doesn't take away the person's dignity, we do. So there are situations when we inadvertently take the person's dignity away. So what is dignity? Dignity is the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or esteemed. And when you look closely, you see that when the person's sense that their dignity is being threatened, they will react they become restless, anxious, then they may engage in behavioral expressions. So we talked about close trusting relationship as the foundation of care for people living with dementia, any person, any elder for that matter. And one of the keys to building those relationships is to know their life history like the palm of your hand. And so, in fact, there's a position in the UK, it's called the locksmith position, where there's a full-time position, and part of the job description is to collect early life history of the person to identify those gems that enable to not only provide dignified care, but engage the person in meaningful activities, personalize their physical environment, engaging in personally meaningful conversations, understand remote triggers from the distance past for behavioral expression, etc. And there's a link here for 20 reasons why we need to know the early life history of these individuals. And if you do it, you may even find fascinating things. In this case, in a VA medical center in Long Island, a resident was gravitating to help another resident in another room. They learned their history. They found they served in the same unit in the Korean War over 60 years earlier. So these are some of the gems, and they moved them to become roommates to enable that supportive relationship. And in fact, people with dementia can teach all of us how to be compassionate to each other. We just need to see sometimes how they fiercely advocate for each other in care homes. And here you have a group of veterans who are, I see that I missed the yellow and the green card earlier. So if that's okay, I'll take 2 minutes to wrap up. Here you have a group of veterans, thank you, Kate, of planting tulips. One resident became anxious and he pushed another resident. He was restrained and taken back to the locked unit. He became distressed when he saw the tulips. So when they reviewed his life history, they found that several of his platoon mates were cornered and killed in a tulip field. So how do we identify those critical pieces of information from the person's past to not only validate the emotions of the person and provide emotional support, but also avoid those triggers from the past? There's another example here that I'm going to skip. You can read it later. And just to say that behavioral expressions, when you look closely, that are labeled aggressive, they're actually often expressions of unmet human needs, and they have meaning and purpose to the person, even if the person may not be able to articulate it. They're attempts to communicate that we need to explore with validation, as Judy Berry tells us. They're attempting to gain control over unwanted, frustrating, frightening situations, and they're trying to preserve their dignity and personhood. And frankly, they are barometers. They could be helpful in enabling us to detect the person's tolerance to stressful stimuli. And as Naomi Feil, again, with her 50 years of experience working with this population, says, there is always a reason behind the behavior, always a reason. But it could be hard work to detect those unmet needs. Here I have two studies. The gold standard in research is video-based studies. And when they looked at resistance to care And when they looked at assaults, I don't like this term, they found that it was often triggered by well-meaning but undertrained and not skilled staff members, whether it was a disrespectful thing that they did, they rushed the resident, they didn't validate their emotions, and residents sensed that the dignity is compromised, and they reacted in that way, in a reactive, protective, defensive way. So I'm going to skip this section. This section is about words that matter. We need to shift from labeling to learning, and from stigma to living outside the stigma. You'll see some definitions here of what we mean by person-directed language. It needs to be accurate, respectful, inclusive, individualized, empowering, non-stigmatizing, and culturally sensitive. And you'll see some examples of terms we would like to avoid with people with dementia. You can see them on the screen here. If we'll have time, we can get back to it later. If not, you can review it later on. And here are some terms that we recommend using instead of those labeling terms. A care home, a person living with dementia, not a dementia patient, behavioral expressions. Some people don't even use behaviors because it's already stigmatizing. Expressions of unmet human needs and rejection of care. So what you want to do is describe what you see using neutral words without judgment and without labels, punching, hitting, kicking, because over time you can detect patterns that are the basis for preventive care. So I apologize that I went over time. What we want to do, this is one of the last slides, is we want to become trusted listeners. Validation is not a magic bullet. You can't fix people up, you can't change them, but you can accept them just the way they are, and you can enter their world and you can feel what they are feeling. You can know that there's good reason behind anything they do, and you can try to communicate. When you build trust with another person and help them express their feelings that they're being bottling up for many years, they feel safe. When you're crying with a woman who misses her husband, when you become a trusted listener, painful feelings will lessen and feelings of self-worth will grow, and this old person can find some peace at the end of their life. So, and just to close here, if all the messages that we share with you today are not successful, please remember, we are all elders in training. About 40% of people are estimated to live at some point in their lives in a nursing home, and tomorrow this could be you. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand it over to Nancy.
Thank you, Bob and Elon, for such profound wisdom. And as we continue to explore the healing power of nurse empathy, here's a perfect moment to take a deep healing and cleansing breath while we change control of the slides. So please join me in considering nurse empathy through both a professional nursing lens and a family member lens. I admit that I am not able to separate the lenses from each other. As a public health nurse for many years, I have lived the unending assessments, the constant collaboration, and the responsibility of care team leadership. From the family member lens, I am ever grateful for the empathy care given by an LPN and many caregivers for my mother. She lived in a memory care community for 5 years. Most of the concerns over those 5 years, and those were pre-COVID years, resulted from a lack of attention to important pieces of her life history and lack of communication of that important information to direct care staff. Both of these lenses have prompted me to advocate for more empathic care among nurses who serve in long-term care communities. And when we are looking at the professional foundations of our practice, we unfortunately still see persistent use of institutional labels in documents, statutes, and language of industry providers for persons receiving care. But if we look deeply into the echoes from our nursing education, we realize that empathy is the essence of our nursing practice. It is the heart of the art of nursing that informs the mind of the science of nursing. The healing power in the relationship between nurses and the persons for whom they care is based in empathy. And empathy is what gives passion and purpose to our practice. And it has what has allowed nurses over time to be viewed as most trusted among healthcare providers. Empathy is strongly embedded within the American Nurses Association Code of Ethics. Those repetitive words, compassion, respect, dignity, worth, unique attributes, and the nurse's primary commitment to the people they serve, and the commitment to advocate and protect the rights, health, and safety of those persons. In the Minnesota Nurse Practice Act, we realized that nurses, registered and licensed practical nurses, are charged to advocate for the best interests of the people they serve, whether individuals or groups. I often wonder if we can find empathy in regulation. So when I searched, I realized it's there if we can just listen to it with our hearts. So orientation in Minnesota statute requires that staff providing assisted living services must be oriented specifically to each individual and the services to be provided. And that we need to use the principles of person-centered planning and service delivery for people living in assisted living, with the addition of promoting resident choice, personal choice, dignity, and care that sustains the person's abilities. And this was added for communities that have dementia services, but it applies to all. The 2021 Minnesota Assisted Living Rule talks about comprehensively providing an evaluation for the person. And the components of an approved uniform assessment tool must be reflected of the routine and preferences of that individual, social needs, leisure needs, spiritual, cultural preferences, and risk for psychological and emotional distress due to personal losses. All of those are empathic qualities. And yet, there are incredible challenges to empathic nursing, as Elon mentioned. It is easily lost in the overwhelming stress of implementing statutes, regulations, corporate policies, the immense staffing challenges, complex nursing roles, and crisis and emergency care that come up almost every day. In a recent study by the American Nurses Foundation, it was noted that despite all these stresses, being seen and being heard is what gives nurses hope. Well, being seen and being heard is exactly what gives hope to people and their families. The good news, empathy is not another burdensome task to accomplish. It is a transformation of the heart that enables us to connect on a deep level with persons for whom we care and build those enduring, close, trusting relationships with the persons we serve, their families, and our caregiving teams. Empathy transforms how we accomplish our roles and responsibilities. And amazingly, empathy rewards the giver as well as the receiver. I read a fictional book about 3 years ago, and there was a quote that stuck with me. I don't have the book reference. The heart regenerates. It always grows a new piece to give away. And so we can transform nursing with empathy. There are multiple areas. We can think about transforming our nursing roles, transforming understanding of and the response to people's expressions and responses, if we take the behavioral word out. And we see there those trigger words: reluctance, resistance, refusal, and aggression. And we can transform daily responsibilities and tasks into relationship building interactions. Thinking about transforming nursing assessment, we know that the initial nursing assessment is our first opportunity to extend empathy to the persons we serve and their families, to understand that person's life history and how it impacts the person's current needs. An opportunity to begin to build that enduring relationship and to develop a care and service plan that values the needs of the person over the routines of the community or the facility. And it is another opportunity to communicate our understanding of that person's history and needs to the care team, person to person, day to day, shift to shift, over time, to ensure quality care. When my mother started receiving care in assisted living, I was told multiple times that in assisted living, we do functional assessment. Well, in thinking about that, we really now need to transform that assessment to a comprehensive assessment, because there are limitations of that traditional functional assessment. It depersonalizes the person. It typically breaks them into separate body parts or functions, and it ignores the complex integration of physical, cognitive, social, and emotional factors. It also minimizes the role of risk factors in preventing problem situations. In other words, a person who is lonely and sad might not be moving as much, might startle easily, might not be well hydrated or well nourished, might have a higher risk for falls. A functional assessment also permits future problem situations to be treated merely as episodic, isolated events without those connections being made to, is this something that is part of that person's history and how has it been managed in the past? And it can lead to delay of or ineffective treatment or care, more frequent severe recurrences of that problem, and an increased possibility of hospitalization and death. And so if we can begin to transform nursing assessment, there are ways to do that. The narrative nursing interview is an accepted nursing practice that is fundamental within nursing education. If we think back to our nursing instructors, encouraging us to learn as much as we can about the person we are caring for today, it is part of who we are. And the narrative interview is uniquely suited to nursing and long-term care settings, where understanding the person's life history is vital to providing person-centered care over an extended period of time. And we are looking at the whole picture, not just a urinary tract infection today, a problem with digestion tomorrow. We're looking at how everything fits. And most care and services are quality of life rather than treatment focused in assisted living. The narrative interview follows a different path than the functional assessment model. It favors open-ended prompts instead of specific programmed questions that complete a checklist in an effort to determine services and fees. But it still allows the nurse to identify those unique needs and determine individualized services. The narrative assessment employs empathy to invite the person's story from that person's own perspective, to validate the person's feelings and emotions, and begin to build that relationship. Interestingly, narrative assessments are beginning to be used more frequently in long-term care communities. Elon talked a little bit about some of these various components of active listening and nonverbal communication. So I am not going to go in detail on those, but I want to focus on two. From a family perspective, to have the nurse partner with and empower the person receiving care to become an active member of that care team, including having the option to direct their own care, is very important, but often missing from the typical long-term care nursing assessment and practice. Too often, once an assessment is complete and a family or person entrusts a loved one or themselves into the care of others, the facility assumes ownership of the person and often makes judgments and decisions about care without including the person or the family member or representative. Sometimes the family is the last to know about changes in a care plan. A second way of transforming nursing roles is through teaching. We talk a lot about training, but training is task-oriented. It's typically focused on a technical skill, the who, what, when, and how to do something in a competent way. Teaching, on the other hand, is person-oriented. It adds critical components. Why the task or care must be done a certain way. I remember working with an unlicensed person caring for a child with disabilities, and we had difficulty getting that person to provide care in the correct way. When I sat down and explained the impact and why the care needed to be done that way, the person looked at me and said, "No one has ever told me why I should do it this way." There was never a concern after that. Teaching also includes adapting for individual preferences. What are some effective approaches that work? What are some cautions or barriers? And what are the benefits of providing that care? It also builds a relationship between the teacher and the learner. As a family member, I learned this quite clearly when an unlicensed caregiver became the teacher. And I started to say something about one of my mother's preferences. And she looked at me and put her hands on her hips and said, "Well, Nancy, she has changed since then." So the teaching and learning goes both ways. Teaching also prepares that learner to apply learning in a consistent, competent, and compassionate manner. And again, as Elon reminded us, every encounter is a teaching opportunity. A third area we can transform is delegation. The Nurse Practice Act talks about delegation as a transfer of authority to someone else to perform a specific nursing task. And Minnesota statute said that a registered nurse may delegate only to people who are competent and possess knowledge and skills consistent with the complexity of the task. Another reason for the why. And that the RN must ensure that a caregiver is trained in the proper methods for each resident and able to demonstrate the ability to competently perform this procedure or task. Also, the assisted living facility must provide sufficient information so that the nurse can actually determine whether there is a good match between caregiver preparation and the person's needs. There are some minefields here in delegation, and we don't have time to go into them. But they are very important in understanding transforming delegation to empowerment, because empowerment is about trust. It is about trusting the staff member to act competently on learned skills and approaches, which is why we need to, as nurses, be responsible for our own delegation empowerment and have to question whether we can accept the standards of a community for completing an online educational program as sufficient to allow us to trust and empower. When we trust that staff member, that LPN or unlicensed staff member becomes the registered nurse's eyes, ears, hands, and heart. And I think of Naomi File and that beautiful screenshot of her. You can just see that she is one with the person. Empowerment is an ongoing process of two-way communication and support, and it demonstrates empathy not only for the person's receiving care, but also for the caregiving team. And it is linked also to the last nursing role that we will talk about, which is supervision. It would be wonderful if we could transform that to supportive guidance, I thought. And then I went back and actually read the Nurse Practice Act, where it says supervision means the guidance of a registered nurse. And Minnesota statute says that the RN needs to verify that the work is being done competently within 30 days of employment and the person first performing a delegated task, and then as needed based on performance. So it's not just a once and done, it's over time. From a family member perspective, there are real minefields here in transforming supervision to supportive guidance. Family members often experience that supervision is used as a corrective or punitive process. We have heard often, we'll write them up. Sometimes it has been used to motivate by intimidation, used to blame or shame, and sometimes publicly in the hope that not only will this person correct their behavior, but everyone else will be intimidated to do so as well. And sometimes it blames not just the staff member for mistakes and errors, but it also blames the family member for complaining. Nancy told me that you did this, which really doesn't help the person who needs care, the caregiver, or the family. From a nursing perspective, transforming supervision to supportive guidance is really important. It's a challenge to establish creative ways to observe or monitor caregiving, and to provide guidance in private. I know it is hard in many situations to have a private place to talk with a caregiver. It is difficult to collaboratively determine what assistance is needed. It is much easier to say, I need you to do it this way. Sometimes that has to happen. We need to make our expectations clear, but we need to do it compassionately. And we need to commit to a time frame for follow-up. It isn't enough to just say, you need to do it this way, and I'm going to be checking up on you. We need to be able to set a time to say, how is this working for you? And then we need to take another step back from our own roles and begin to transform our understanding, as Elon talked about individuals' expressions and responses. Well, the words reluctance, resistance, and refusal, I honestly heard those every time I visited my mother, at least 3 times a week for 5 years. It is hardwired into long-term care language. We must do better. It is a judgmental label that assigns blame to a person for not complying with our expectations. And we have to change that. Aggression is a judgmental label that assigns blame to a person for those unmet needs and actions no longer fully under their control. And it also assigns blame to the person for inept caregiver approaches, which then flows back to the teaching and learning that prepares the caregiver. We need to recognize that this is a nurse caregiver problem to solve. Everyone presents with a need. It is often not what it seems. The person who keeps trying the door to say, I need to go home, I need to go home. Maybe that is not what they need. Maybe they are uncomfortable. Maybe they are bored. Maybe they are lonely. It is the obligation of the professional to determine and meet the actual need. And so we need to consider more deeply why. When we transform our understanding of reluctance, resistance, and refusal, and I will admit, these words are hardwired in me. Elon and I talked through our presentations a couple of times. The words are still in there no matter how many times we try to remove them. But we need to go back and think about, maybe it's not the right time for us to provide a bathing experience for a person. Maybe there are longstanding or emerging fears. The person often does not hear, understand, or might have difficulty processing the request or prompt. Or they may not recognize the nurse or caregiver. Or we may be in a hurry. And so we are trying to get the task done quickly without allowing the person to participate as they are able. The person may be embarrassed to need help from strangers with intimate care, and the response may no longer be within their abilities. If we think about a deeper understanding of aggression, we again have those unmet needs. Is it comfort? Is it a need for meaningful activity or the absence of familiar routines? Is it companionship that's needed? Or is there an effort to maintain dignity? Again, processing. People often perceive an invasion of personal space, especially when someone moves in quickly or from an angle that they cannot see, or they may not recognize the intruder. And again, sometimes the person is embarrassed to need care. And for us to reflect that in our busy lives, when care is hurried, rushed, people become more confused and we see more defensive responses. So if we can transform our own responses, we honor that person's dignity. We anticipate needs to prevent all that stuff that might be uncomfortable or unsafe for the person and staff. We acknowledge and validate the person's experiences and feelings. We assist them to calm. We adapt our approaches to meet unique needs. What worked for my mother did not work for another person living in the community with her. If we really understand, we will continually educate team members to a more empathic approach. And we will respond as immediately as we can when we hear judgmental language by care team members. And that is hard to do, but we must do it. We have to do better. We can discuss why the person may have responded in a certain way and we can think about collaborative ways of developing alternative approaches. From a family member perspective, we really are so grateful when nurses transform daily responsibilities with empathy. There are many areas where this can be done. These are simple and difficult. Using our loved ones' preferred names. Please don't call them honey, sweetheart, dear, bud, or pal. Please give them the dignity of who they are. Please learn about our loved ones' life histories and the people who are important to them. It was at the end of my mother's life when a caregiver approached me and said, I can't understand why your mom is calling for this particular nurse, whose name was. Well, I said, I can answer that. That was my father's name. And so knowing those important people are critical. Please be present with our loved ones on a regular basis. I call this the creative nursing approaches to rounds. If a nurse joins in a meal once a week with the people living in a memory care community, you'll learn a lot about the care provided, the people who are there and how they interact with each other. And you have a head start on your next nursing reassessment. Please honor our loved ones' life preferences and incorporate them into the life of the community rather than expecting our loved ones to adapt to the community routine. And engage our loved ones in meaningful activities while avoiding using the TV as a default caregiver. My mother loved to smooth and fold things. A pile of napkins out of the dryer kept her busy for a long period of time. Looking through magazines is another way that we engage people. And this engagement needs to be done by more than just the activities director. Please talk with our loved ones at every opportunity. They love to hear compliments and words that connect to their earlier lives. And it will be new to them each time, even though you've already said it 7 times today. Use clear animated voices to help mitigate their impaired attention and hearing. And speak from a position where our loved ones can see who is talking to them. A phrase I learned years ago, go low, go slow. Touching our loved ones often. You know, we touch in many ways. We touch with the sound of our voice. We touch with our eyes. We touch with our hands. Knowing when and how to touch, as Elon said, is important. But touch helps our loved ones from feeling lost and to stay connected in an unfamiliar world. It builds enduring relationships over time, and it helps our loved ones to self-calm. And another way that people can help is by offering our loved ones choices in all aspects of activity of daily living and care. There is always a choice. I know Bob talked about the sense of choices being taken away. And my message to my nurse colleagues is, please teach your caregiving staff the many, many ways that choices can be altered in situations. A last group of encouragement to adapt approaches to our loved ones' changing abilities. As one caregiver pointed out to me, the way it was yesterday is not how it is today necessarily. And inviting instead of directing. Sue, let's try. Bill, please help me. And offering assistance rather than taking over a care or an activity. Providing and modeling a slow pace of assistance and care, allowing our loved ones time to respond. And I know in COVID, this is extremely difficult, but in the long run, it's a time saver if the person can participate with us and we don't have any safety events that we need to deal with. And then please be proactively transparent about mistakes and errors and respond in a manner that prevents similar events community-wide in the future. A lot of times, as nurses, we try to cover up or whitewash things that have happened. It's really helpful to be able to be honest. And then the most challenging of all, removing and advocating for removal of all judgmental language from all systemic, electronic, and written documentation, and all communication with family members and other community members. It is really very sad to hear your mother refused, your father is resisting. It is exceedingly painful. So I encourage you to think of ways of doing that. I know I have gone over 2, so 1 more minute. The minefields of advocating for empathy-infused care, of course, is moral distress. When we see something that we believe is unethical, we need to deal with the cost of speaking out. We are a minority healthcare professional in a hospitality business model. And then the question I get asked all the time, can empathy be taught? I believe strongly yes. Stephen M.R. Covey, in his book, The Speed of Trust, talks about 3 simple words: see, speak, and behave. If we see and understand with empathy, and if we communicate with empathy and remove judgmental language and model empathic language and behavioral approaches and care, and we expect that others will act in a similar way, I believe over time, we will teach empathy to all those that we have trusted and empowered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Elon and Bob. I hope others enjoyed and learned as much as I did from your guys' presentations. We did have a request to take a look at the old words. And Elon, when we get to that slide, I'd ask you just to talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll open to other questions.
Thank you, Chris and Kate. So, you know, there are many ways in which the dignity of an older person could be compromised. One way is the words we use, the language we use. And unfortunately, we still hear many of those terms that you see on the slide in the media, in care practice, in research, and in policy. I think we should move away from those words. Language is evolving, and maybe in a few years, my recommended words in the next slide would be unacceptable already, but that's okay. But I think we should move away from using the word facility, because these are homes for these individuals, care homes. Memory care unit, we don't care for memories, we care for human beings. But it's an excellent marketing term. We no longer should say dementia patient. We should say a person living with dementia. And we should, the term, many of you may not know that the term BPSD, behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, is banned, has been banned by a lot of people living with dementia. It should be called, as L. Power says, behavioral and psychological symptoms of over-medicalized dementia. Inappropriate, what is inappropriate? We have to understand their realities through their own lived experience. and what may be inappropriate in our eyes may be completely understandable from their perspective. They're not disruptive. They're not sound downing. In fact, a study showed that only a quarter of people in their early and late evening hours experience irritability and anxiety with dementia in nursing homes. And Cohen Mansfield, the renowned researcher, asked to stop using the term sundowning. It's what their human needs are that driving what they're doing at the moment. They're not wandering, they're seeking a sense of security, a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a sense of doing something purposeful. They may be bored, in pain. And they're not eloping. They're seeking a safe a place to be, or fulfill a human need. And also with regards to the aggressive behaviors terms, people with dementia, the vast majority of them are not abusive, not violent, not aggressive even. They are responding, reacting to their unmet human needs, and they're not perpetrators. They are doing their best with their brain disease to cope with an environment that is becoming distressing and frankly frightening to them, being forced to live with many people with others with dementia in small quarters, or with a roommate. They're not stalkers, they're not pinchers, they're not grabbers, they're not strippers, and they're not hoarders. And they don't resist care. They reject undignified care, as those two video-based studies have demonstrated. They're not seeking attention, they're seeking our empathy. And when we do, we are in a position to enable them not only to experience their highest practical, emotional, and physical well-being, but also to preserve their dignity. So I just wanted to touch base on those terms that should not be used anymore. They're stigmatizing, they're labeling, and they're hurting people with dementia. And that's the part I wanted to kind of add. And I wonder if Bob has any thoughts or comments that you want to share, or just to give you the opportunity in case you had some thoughts when we were speaking for so long.
I'm just very impressed with the whole presentation. I've learned a lot myself from the presentation today, and I consider it a real privilege for me to be here and to be able to share my voice. These are types of things that really empower me, and I hope help people better understand how people living well with dementia.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for these words. We are honored that you agreed to join forces with us. And in every discussion about the care and life of people with dementia should participate because it's their life and it's their care. So we're trying to adhere to the saying that people with dementia tell us nothing about us without us. So thank you, Bob, for taking the time today to share your insights with us. And I wish you well, I wish you good health, and we will be in touch in the future.
Thank you, Elon, and thank you, everybody. We have gone over our time, and I appreciate everybody's patience with that. As you can see, there's a great deal to talk about here, and our experts have done a fabulous job, and I have to echo Elon's sentiment, Bob. It was awesome to have you here as a part of that. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but feel free, reach out to me and I'll pass on the questions that you may have to whomever that might make sense. And thank you for joining us today. And I have a very blessed holiday season coming up. And with that, I think we will say goodbye.